directly from the mouth of the beast himself, the eater of souls, of children, of all things that are pure and good. Now, whether one believes Crowley was a successful magician and sorcerer, or just some heroin-addicted, sex-crazed pedophile that liked to play dress-up, Aleisters was a forerunner for the dark awakening of the 20th century, the new age that has been rapidly taking shape since around 1963. Surrounded by his mission to bring the Aeon of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, casting a spell of mass depravity, and epidemic of fascination with children as sexual objects, and society in itself acting, feeling, and behaving as children. Impressionable, curious, yet vile, perverted, and demented. This spirit was unleashed in 1904 when Crowley received the Book of the Law in Cairo, Egypt. This spirit was aimed to bring on the age of Horus, a new age where will to power is the law under love. And love means nothing more than desire, limitless desire, that is. Disobedience rules the heart, and darkness carries its followers. Liberation through transgression. Freedom through lawlessness. Some would say Crowley had the biggest impact on contemporary culture. He did not start this dark spiritual movement, yet it was continued through him. As one of many children of Satan, he was a conduit, a vehicle for the new age and occult revival of the 20th century. As a seminal figure in the evolution of our debased popular culture, it is important that we evaluate where his marks were made and how they still seem to remain to this day, and have only intensified in their effect. Crowley helped evoke a massive wave of cultural transformation by use of three prime elements: sex, drugs, and art. I will be chronologically revealing how the Crowleyan philosophy has, behind the shadows, shaped and indoctrinated and manifested our socio-cultural fabric to present day. What do I mean by art? Or should we say the arts, which are entertainment, poetry, literature, paintings, movies, and music. See, Crowley believed art is magic and magic is art. He recognized it had the ability to induce direct change in the mind, influence material reality, and by use of performance art, as in plays or concerts, the magic of art could induce psychophysiological transformations in the event or ritual's participating audience. Very similar to the same conclusions and motives of the sorcerers behind the Princeton radio project we discussed in part 1. Eventually, you will see how all these ideas tie in together. All the mediums intersect, and all the witches, scientists, and entertainers and artists are in the same business, with the same goals and under the same dictating force. Whether they realize it or not, the show must go on. Though Crowley is oft celebrated as a rebellious enemy of the status quo, he in fact was an heir to an aristocratic family. His parents were members of the Exclusive Brethren Order, a high-level sect of the Plymouth Brethren, an occult Quaker order of Gnostic Christians. He also attended the elite school Trinity College in Cambridge. Yes, the same school pioneering which John Dee attended. Crowley had very deep power elite ties and always worked for the engineers of society. As a deep agent of MI6 and confidant of Churchill and well-known statesman in many Masonic lodges, Crowley's ideas and presence left indentations throughout the earth, inspired many men in high places, and helped develop a dark awakening that would change the world for generations to come. What is important to understand here is not so much the abilities and actions of Crowley himself, but the value system that he advocated, the culture, the spirit and worldview that he embodied. The same value system, that same spirit, has echoed throughout the decades. Though changing its tones here and changing its wardrobe and tempo there, it has always remained, lingered, festered even. It has grown on the back of society like a wicked fungus, as we now find ourselves dead center of a new age and aeon of Horus. But how did we get here? In part one, we took a look at the Princeton radio project and the beginning of social engineering via mass media, plus the cultural manufacturing of the teenager identity of the late 40s and early 50s. This brings us to about 1953 in our timeline. There are a few years as significant as this year, possibly 1963 and 69 are about even, but we will cover their significance later. And 1953 was sure to be a game-changing year and birth of a new movement, new technology, and new influences on the culture that would systematically bring in the new age and aeon of Horus, what some may call the new Babylon or age of Aquarius. I prefer to call it the post-reality era, but they all fit the same. Some may say, oh well, many things happen every year. Every year has its significant moments and events of change. Though this bears its obvious truths, not many years appear to have a patterned and purposeful intent like the happenings of 1953. Three important factors amongst others, though these appear to hold the most significance, which are, first, the American establishment of new socio-psychological research of London's Tavistock Institute via Operation Paperclip. Second, success of the many Macy conferences on cybernetics and mind science that followed, like MKUltra. And third, and most importantly, the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, in 1947. Merely a converted organization of government psychologists, banking lawyers, and military officials from the prior OSS, or Office of Strategic Services. These three developments would lead to mass organization of splinter cell operations that would all take place in 1953. These operations all focused on four specific areas, only by way of a deep studied and practiced knowledge in the occult, psychology, and anthropology, of course. These areas were human sexuality, mind-altering substances or drugs, and media, and its relationship with behavior. Sex, drugs, media, and mind control. First, let's start with drugs. MKUltra had many sub-projects and operations, though one of its largest in scale was the Operation Native Revival. This operation was set to investigate the tribal and indigenous use of hallucinogenic substances across the world, as well as hallucinogenic substances created in labs, and double agent provocateurs or intelligent psychologists and anthropologists disguised as entertainment personalities and artists, writers, etc. were used to not only do the studies, but recruit the test subjects and promote their findings through the culture. In 1953, Gordon Wasson, the man who coined and popularized magic mushrooms, voyaged indigenous parts of Mexico to promote mushroom use and ancient beneficial properties of psilocybin under MKUltra Subproject 58, which was later promoted by the typical Time Life magazine group in 1957. Also in 1953, Beat Generation writer William S. Burroughs, whom we will be diving into later, was magically making his way through Peru in search of ayahuasca, which would later become famous via the Yage Papers in '68. Oh, and guess who mysteriously happened to try mescaline for the first time in 1953? An experience that would lead him to write the mind-shattering and culture-transforming book Doors of Perception, thanks to MKUltra proponent Dr. Osmond, the one and only Aldous Huxley. Oh, but it does not end there. To join in with this mega pantheon of agents of influence, we have none other than the aforementioned CIA technical services that approve use of LSD for MKUltra sub-projects across the United States. Mushrooms, ayahuasca, peyote, and LSD. Interesting that all of these soon-to-be famous individuals just happen to be discovering the properties of these drugs in this same year, and all just happen to be directly tied to secret intelligence cells within the CIA, or MI6. Just as the CIA begins its projects on the relationship between human behavior and mind-altering substances. 1953, exactly 1 decade before the psychedelic explosion hits the American youth culture. Interesting, no? Next is human sexuality. In 1953, the Kinsey Reports released the groundbreaking Sexual Behavior in Human Females, written by Kraulijs and good friend of Kenneth Anger, Alfred Kinsey, changing our perception on sexuality for women forever, and included this single most influential publication on the male libido in history is formed by trained psychologist and CIA operative Hugh Hefner with the Playboy magazine. Ron Jeremy is also born this year, one of the most famous pornographic actors to date. These two would go on to form a wrecking ball in the American moral establishment, damage we are still sustaining today. In media, well, Alan Watts, another key New Age figure we will be going into later, starts his mind-bending mystic philosophy program on the Infinite KPFA radio station in 1953. Setting the tone and preparing the conditioning of a soon-to-come counterculture, New Age worldview. And possibly most grabbing is the introduction of the color television, right in time for the surge of Hollywood and entertainment that brews in the dark studios of Southern California and New York City. Should we also mention that the same year, and oh so conveniently, Mega Food Corp Swanson released the American staple meal, the TV dinner, opening up the new market of convenience food, all to make your life easier and keep you in front of the television as much as possible, even while you are eating. Taking the typical family away from the dinner table where bonding and values are experienced and learned, to be atomized into separate units plugged into the show or news propaganda of the evening, which leads us directly to the concept of mind control. In 1953, Ron L. Hubbard, after splintering from Crowley's OTO, starts the infamous Church of Scientology, one of the largest and most successful science fiction cults to exist. At, and yes, the same time, as the CIA sponsors the Robertson Panel to discuss the reality and possibilities of a UFO threat to national security in 1953. The follow-up panel to the previous Air Force-sponsored UFO studies, the SIGN program and the Grudge program under the Project Blue Book umbrella, setting off the early stages of mind control that would eventually lead to the socially accepted belief in outer worlds, galaxies, and foreign life forms, and ultimately, the Great Alien Deception. So when we clearly see that the intelligence operations regarding drugs, sex, and aliens were being researched and developed pre-1960, even within the same single year, it does not make it difficult to understand the rampant evolution of these concepts found in society today, and why those whom have little to no knowledge at all on this history would call you crazy or loony for questioning it. Drug use, pornography, science fiction, pop culture in general, all of these things have been strategically manufactured and utilized to influence that which makes you, you. This patterned history and across-the-board intelligence agency involvement and funding makes it even more obvious how all these things have and always have had to do with nothing but mind control, social engineering, spiritual possession, and cultural creation. But let's continue. also beginning in 1953, is by far the most significant social movement in American history. One that would capitalize on the development of the rebellious and outcast, jaded teenager. A movement that would bring all creeds and colors, kinks and quirks together into a humanist lust and spunk ball of pleasantly confused chaos. Postmodernist, tough stuff bad girls and bad boys, rebels without a cause. Or was there a cause? Some would say freedom, some would say gay rights, some would say equal rights, some just wanted to get high and listen to bad music and blame all their woes and pros on the man.
Emotions and mocking the everyday course of modern society, intent on striking back as they wage a battle for their right to be heard. Getting pushed around so long, you start pushing back harder and harder. You get to like it. You feel like somebody.
This movement of rejects and rebels were moreover addicts and narcissists, plagued by idealism or the obsession with things being equal, with life being fair, as if one is owed a fair and ideal experience on earth from birth. Similar to the SJW movement we are witnessing today, the Beats suffered a pathologic angst that fed on their minds through their destructive and malignant culture. As a base philosophical worldview, they were a postmodern movement. They practiced and preached postmodernism. What's postmodernism? Well, it's essentially the perspective and value system of the liberal or libertarian New Age. There is no objective truth. God is most likely an alien planet somewhere or a giant cube in outer space. And that's if God even exists. We'll have moral relativism, non-aggression theory, sometimes a little scientism, sometimes a little pagan spirituality. Pretty much anything goes in postmodernism. Whatever floats your boat or sinks it is okay and accepted, as long as it agrees with postmodernism. You will find materialism, humanism, and mainly an utter disdain for anything Christian, anything with a strict order, categorization system, form, rules, maturity, and objective moral law. Postmodernism aims to deconstruct thousands of years of a developed Western worldview. It is the acceptance of insanity as sanity. Beginning in collectivism, unity, love, human rights, etc., and then ending in transhumanist technocracies and global police states. Recognizing that the most influential youth culture in Western history was founded in such a worldview and set of values makes it quite easy to see it blatantly dripping through our culture today and playing right into the hands of the mono state as the synthesis needed to manufacture the monoculture of one people, no truth, and surely no God of any authority, at least. In postmodernism, the self is the authority, which actually means the state is the authority, since the state indirectly controls the self via mind control techniques and spiritual possession by way of ego manipulation. Hence the Beat Generation, the first major movement of postmodernism that would shape the next 6 decades into the post-reality era land of Caitlyn Jenner and Donald Trump. What is important to recognize is the main headlining figures of the Beat movement. In its early days, pre-1963, there were the headliners Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William S. Burroughs. Yes, Thompson and Cassidy are important as well, but they will play into the story a bit later. Before we go into these dubious characters, we must remember that they influenced millions over the years and still have a huge impact on culture to this day, especially academically and in the university system. When one mentions the idea of culture creators or agents of influence, very few names match up to the prowess and hypnotic nature of Ginsberg, Kerouac, and Burroughs. What's also important to remember is what they shared in common, what fueled their engines and comprised their values. Things like drugs and addiction, depression, and even insanity. Both Burroughs and Ginsberg spent time in psych wards. In fact, Allen Ginsberg spent most of his adolescence visiting his mother in mental facilities, which she eventually ended up committing suicide in. Both Ginsberg and Burroughs were erratic homosexuals with a twisted and depraved sensibility that fell all throughout their writings. For instance, the piece that brought Ginsberg to fame in 1956 and blasted like a late-night marathon for months on the KPFA radio station was his piece Howl. Simply a homoerotic fit of a poem that would only come from a very dark and disturbed individual. Yet it was praised, heavily promoted by establishment-funded liberal media outlets, and a new movement was formed. Or Burroughs' perverted, heroin addict bloodlust novel that made him famous called Naked Lunch. Burroughs was by far the most depraved and borderline psychotic out of the entire Beats movement. In fact, he shot and killed his own wife on accident when bat spit high on a drug cocktail and saw no jail time at all. Some documents say within his famous Yage papers, a book of letters he wrote to Allen Ginsberg in 1953, that he killed a man while on his Peru expedition looking for ayahuasca. Burroughs represented the repression of a sick civilization, a leader of an existential insanity that was being promoted at the time, and would continue to be promoted for the following generations. Yes, Burroughs was merely a bored and butthurt trust fund kid with deep-tied intelligence connections. Some believe he was sent to gather data on ayahuasca by CIA co-founder himself, Wild Bill Donovan. The same Wild Bill that tapped Burroughs to join the OSS once graduating from, of course, Tavistock Academic Facility, Harvard University. When one figures he became famous once he returned from Peru and helped spawn a massive drug culture that would develop to the end of the century, things seem to be all too clear. So where does Crowley fit into all of this, aside from the shared interests in heroin and gay intercourse? Well, it is known that Burroughs was an avid occultist, obsessed with magic, Hermeticism, and even Scientology. Burroughs was a witch in his own right, a follower of the orgasm-obsessed Freudian psychologist Wilhelm Reich, a Scientologist and supporter of NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association, the same NAMBLA that Allen Ginsberg was a staunch advocate and registered member of.
So a big, huge, beautiful painting of a naked boy sitting on a Greek-bordered couch with some, I think, a little flower pot at his feet, his legs spread, with very nicely painted genitals and a very handsome face, sort of like a Greek faun or something, like just really striking. And I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, that's my friend Peter Orlovsky who lives here." And then Peter walked into the room. Really tore my heart out.
Ginsberg was also a mystic of sorts, and also was heavily influenced by Wilhelm Reich. So influenced, he even wrote him a letter directly when he was in college at the University of Columbia, where the Beat generation was formed until it moved to San Francisco and skyrocketed, mutated, and transformed into the counterculture in 1964. Ginsberg was a spiritual freak of nature, a beast-minded fiend that came across gentle, loving, and tolerant, inclusive. What ties Ginsberg into Crowley, aside from his Crowleyan sidekick Burroughs, was his connection with another seminal figure in the Crowleyan spiritual movement of the mid-20th century, and that was Harry Everett Smith. Smith also was a Beat generation figurehead and monumental influence on the counterculture that would come in the next several years. Smith was indeed simply an open Crowleyite. Further, he was in fact a member of the OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis, one of Crowley's brotherhoods. Harry Smith was a Kabbalist and Gnostic. In fact, he utilized both to cast a spell on society when he ritually designed and released his anthology on American folk music. Said to have been the single album that jump-started the folk and blues music revival that would carry the 50s and play as the foundation of the psychedelic rock era. Ginsberg was a close friend of Smith. In fact, they both attempted to make the Pentagon levitate with an early punk band called the Fugs in an anti-establishment sacred ritual, though it appears they were unsuccessful. Harry Smith was raised by parents who were both in the Theosophical Society. His father was also a high-level Mason. Obsessed with Enochian magic, we find Smith's connection to the work of John Dee and his magical effect on society through his witchcraft-laden folk anthology album. I guess it wouldn't be a leap of the imagination to accept the idea that he was a huge influence on the career of Bob Dylan, one of the devil's very own and beloved workmen. Smith introduced Ginsberg to many dark aspects of the occult, and Ginsberg was receptive and giddy. He mixed these rituals with drugs, sex, and profanity that filled his poems. Ginsberg was a Boar's Head Society member at the Columbia University under the Frankfurt School Liberal Arts Department tutelage. Columbia of New York was where the Frankfurt School actually received its start in American education in the 1930s. Ginsberg and crew were the perfect twisted bunch to help indoctrinate the masses with their blind zeal, shared perversions, and diluted perspectives, and overall hatred for Christian morality. Postmodern communist sympathizing, alternative lifestyle vanguard was Allen Ginsberg, the Aleisters Crowley of academia, a witch in teacher's clothing.
Worked for a long while in marketing research, doing statistical work, determining what kind of minds you have.
Ginsberg and the Beats liked drugs, and they despised reality. They were looking for something more, something deeper. So it is no surprise they were big fans of Aldous Huxley, who was enjoying his book Doors of Perception fame, and with assistance of Tavistock Institute of London and the Central Intelligence Agency, he developed a mind control program called the Human Potential Movement, which would be the ticket that brought the hippies, or at the time hipsters, together with the Beats and along with all the other fringe New Age groups to create the counterculture. But Huxley needed a location, an escape venue, a school even for this movement. So in 1962, the Esalen Institute was started, a spiritual resort facility constructed on an existential voyage into reality and postmodernism of French and German psychology, psychological theory, mixed with Eastern mysticism and the humanities. What bridged the gap was Michael Murphy of Stanford University and the Beat Generation celebrity Richard Price, who would be one of the first Beats to join the Institute, and along with him came Ginsberg and all the rest, together to form a new humanist liberation front based on love, insanity, drugs, and promiscuity. The Epistemology Center for the New Age and premier drug-based mind control project of the CIA under Operation MKUltra, and only the groovy, hip, and far out were invited. Next, we step into the first blood of our domestic version of Project Phoenix. In 1963, Americans suffered from a mass psychological operation and death ritual that some call the killing of the king. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated and transformed the psyche of America instantly, and placed a dark spirit across its waters, city streets, and neighborhood homes. Was he actually murdered? Or was he shipped to some secret elite island somewhere with the rest of the fake Death Brotherhood members? Well, that's a debate that matters very little to the overall effect of this event. This ritual would seal the fate of a once somewhat united American society, one with potential, one with still a sense of balance, tradition, and cohesive moral standard. It was here where the social split began. The mental break of a nation happened that day in America, and it appears as though The entire event was set, designed, and carried out to produce this precise reaction. A clear representation of a mass trauma-based mind control technique. Socio-psychological terrorism. Again, another Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. Unleashed on society in time to offset any possibility of social balance, priming them for the new wave of enmity, incoherence, jive, and propaganda that would be smashing into their lives over the next several years. A battlefield of civil rights was taking its shape. The psychedelic era was on the horizon, and an entire society had been shaken and stirred right in time to embrace it. With a war overseas looming, vast MKUltra drug projects in their advanced states of research, moles, educators, celebs, and agents of influence in their proper places to administer indoctrination, America stood as a sitting duck in still waters, quietly before the storm. The storm begins in 1964, and the phasing out of American Christian morale takes its step forward. Though social unrest was growing in the South, setting precedent for the Black Power movement that would take shape in a couple years, on the West Coast something else was brewing. Under the auspices of Tavistock Institute and Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, the work of the recently passed Aldous Huxley, who strangely died the same day as John F. Kennedy, also the Johnny Appleseed of acid, Al Hubbard, and anthropologist Gregory Bateson, was in full swing. The Human Potential Movement via Esalen Institute promoted the doctrines of Gregory Bateson and Gordon Wasson's native revival projects and normalized hallucinogenic drugs and mood-enhancing substances to the Beat generation and its followers. Beatniks, hippies, and rejects abroad were now a complete movement. The counterculture was born. After being recruited by Bateson, Stanford's Ken Kesey, writer of MKUltra novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was dosed with LSD in the famous Menlo Park projects. Bateson would later recruit Allen Ginsberg to join. Kesey was sent out on a mass dosing social project with the Merry Pranksters, a covert psyop squad that would popularize the mind-deforming and spiritually possessing substance LSD. Neil Cassidy, popular Beat Generation member, would become the driver of the Merry Prankster party bus, named Further, tying the Beat Generation right into the psychedelic era. From the Merry Pranksters would come the Grateful Dead, another Tavistock-controlled psyop band that was also dosed in the Bates and Menlo Park LSD projects. Members of the Bohemian Grove Society, and all children of Masonic families. The Grateful Dead was managed by Alan Trist, son of Tavistock scientist Eric Trist. Also in the handling and directing of the Grateful Dead was CIA psychologist Hank Harrison, whom is also the father of Courtney Love. But that is another story we will have to save for when we get into the 90s, back to summer of '64. So the hippie generation, deadheads, psychedelic rock, and LSD popularity came directly out of the CIA Tavistock-funded and guided Merry Prankster group of the West Coast, and the Carnegie and Mellon-funded Harvard Research Group of Leary on the East Coast. Later, which would produce the psychedelic drug-running gang, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, where eventually both sides would come together under one umbrella, solidifying the degenerate culture once and for all in '67 at the Human Be-In Festival in San Francisco, Golden Gate Park. From the early days of the Beats and Harry Smith's folk revival to the psychedelic era with characters like Wavy Gravy, who will become one of the prime LSD dispensers in the counterculture. In fact, this is the guy who supplied the quote-unquote bad acid at Woodstock. Along with Wavy Gravy would come the most infamous of the bunch, though Al Hubbard, and not to be confused with L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology fame, might have pushed more physical LSD, but Timothy Leary sold the culture of LSD. He sold the worldview of the hippie generation. He embodied the spirit of freedom through rebellion that defined America at the time. An open CIA operative, psychologist, and Harvard man, Timothy Leary was a devout Crowleyite. In fact, he openly explains in many interviews how he felt he was continuing the work that Crowley left off when he passed. Harry Smith surprisingly stated nearly the same sentiments, both continuing in the great work of the beast and contributing to the destabilization and spiritual possession of humanity.
They're looking for magic. Because there's a moment when you see something like that, there's a crack in your mind. And that crack lets in all the light. It opens up all the possibilities. It just goes, wow, did you see that? That's the moment. That puts them in touch with the invisible.